Hi, I'm Phil Harwell, and this is my 88th video discussing British science fiction writers. In my previous videos, I showed how many of these writers had also published detective fiction, and one of the principal exponents of this duality was John Glasby. His latest detective novel, This Time Forever, has recently been published by Wildside Press in the US. The novel was first published in 1957, but unlike all of Glasby's other crime novels, had never been reprinted until now, after nearly 70 years. Why? Well, I'm pleased to reveal its complicated backstory. In 1956, UK publishers John Spencer and Company Limited were one of the few mushroom firms who survived the changing publishing climate that decimated so many of their contemporary publishers. The post-war decade had been notorious for the sometimes wretchedly poor standards of the opportunist new publishers who had sprang up like mushrooms to exploit the national paper shortages in Britain when virtually anything printed was assured of a sale. But by 1956, after numerous court prosecutions of these publishers for unsavoury material and the easing of paper supplies, enabling regular publishers to return, most of them went out of business. John Spencer had been one of the worst offenders, so some might wonder how they survived. One reason may have been that it had been immensely profitable because of low overheads. Their wretched payments to authors, 10 and 6 1,000 words, were only half that of the standard lowest rate. But the main reason was that they were adept at exploiting a few of their better writers by guaranteeing to publish everything they wrote. Talented writers were thus tempted to churn out first draft material that they could sell to Spencers instantly, without any need for polishing or revision. Spencer's most talented and prolific author in this regard was John Glasby, who provided them with a steady stream of literally hundreds of competent short stories and novels across all genres: science fiction, westerns, romances, foreign legion adventure novels, and detective fiction. When the call went out for detective novels, Glasby created a series of novels featuring Johnny Merrick, an ex-con turned private eye operating out of Los Angeles. These novels were very successful, and Spencer would later reprint some of them under different titles and bylines without notifying or paying the author. The publisher was also able to sell them for overseas foreign translations in several countries, again without any further payments to the author. By these devious means, John Spencer's Badger books survived for several decades thereafter, only eventually fading out with the deaths of their principal directors. When I became Glasby's literary agent, I set about reselling his old novels. Rackets Incorporated, aka Blood on My Shoulder, Reef for a Lady, and The Savage City were reprinted in the Linford Mystery Library. Glasby then revived his private eye, Johnny Merrick, at my request, and a further 7 brand new, superb Johnny Merrick novels were sold before the author's death in 2011. Here we see their first UK editions in the Linford Mystery Library. Now, the first 3 of these novels, these Merrick novels, were then reprinted in the US by Borgo, and 2 of them had recycled sandpaper covers. But one Johnny Merrick crime novel stubbornly remained out of print. This Time Forever, John Spencer, 1957. The reason for this was simple. I'd been unable to find a copy. This title turned out to be a very rare book indeed. John Spencer had never been in the habit of providing author copies, so Glasby himself had never possessed a copy. Amongst collectors, the only known copy had belonged to the late Bob Adie, an internationally known expert and collector of impossible crime novels, famous for his non-fiction reference book, Locked Room Murders. You see Bob's book, very famous book. The Locked Room Murders became the Bible of fans and collectors of impossible crime stories. Details of the Locked Room plot of This Time Forever have been given in his book, making it a legendary collector's item. Bob's entry read, you see the entry here, bear with me. Bob's entry read, "Death by hydrocyanic acid poisoning in a locked room." And after revealing the solution, he'd commented, "A surprisingly good attempt to fuse together the classic detection novel with the American gangster thriller, or at least its British version. Excellent solution also, if it's practicable." Now, Bobby Eddy was a good friend of mine. That's me with Bob there, quite a few years ago now. And in the early 2000s, he loaned me several of his rare detective titles for me to copy and resell for some of my new agency clients, most notably Gerald Verner. But alas, I was not then the agent for Glasby, so had no interest in asking Bob to loan me this particular title during his lifetime. Years later, in attempting to find a copy of this rare book, I contacted many collectors worldwide, only to learn that they too were searching for this elusive title. So the book stubbornly remained out of print. And then in 2023, Eddie Jones, a collector friend, who I'd helped years earlier by sending him copies of the dust wrappers of John Russell Fearn's rarest impossible crime novels, delighted me by telling me that after decades of fruitless searching for the book, he'd finally managed to obtain not a copy of the actual book, but JPEGs of This Time Forever, and he sent me these images via his telephone, which I downloaded. At last I was able to read the novel, but alas, I lacked the software and technical savvy to print the images out, so that I could then scan them into Word to enable the novel to be reprinted. It looked as if I faced the daunting task of copying the entire novel out by hand and then retyping it. I started to do this, but then remembered Dong Hang, known to Western friends as Elliot, a Chinese collector with whom I'd been in correspondence some years earlier. I'd helped Elliot by sending him photocopies of several authentic signatures from my author's agency clientele, including those of Sid Bounds, John Russell Fearn and John Glasby, who'd written impossible crime novels, which he wanted to reproduce in a reference book for collectors published in Chinese. We see that book here, a compendium of signatures from classic mystery writers, and we can see Eliot's letter about it. There's the book. And there's Eliot's letter, if you can read that. Scan that. And here we see the actual signatures. There we see Sid Bounds and the other famous authors who recognise the names of them. Incredible collection of signatures. John Glasby. Where's John Glasby? Let's see the signature. There we are. And there's also John Russell Fearn. There we are. Amazing book. It's got Agatha Christie and all sorts of authors, all included in Eliot's book. Now, Eliot in turn had helped me by sending me 4 issues of a pre-war Chinese science magazine, Popular Science, August through November 1933, published by the Chinese Science Company, which focused on disseminating scientific knowledge. These turned out to serialize the first ever reprinting of Fearn's first novel, The Intelligent Gigantic. I wrote about them in 2019 in my article in Paperback Parade number 103. Just have a quick glance at that article here. There's the article. And there we see the first, what everybody thought was the first book edition of Fearn's novel, The Intelligent Gigantic, published in 1943 by Wordsworth. But I discovered it had actually been reprinted in Chinese in 1935, many years earlier. So this Chinese edition is the first book edition, not the world's work. And this edition had been preceded by the novel being serialized in this Chinese magazine, which I mentioned. Amazing discovery. This unsuspected or unknown 1930s translation came as an amazing revelation to me, and I was tremendously grateful to my Chinese friend. I'd offered to reciprocate. Was there some English story he needed a copy of? There was indeed. You've guessed it. As an impossible crime collector, he wanted a copy of This Time Forever. Alas, I didn't have a copy, but I promised him that if I ever did, then I'd send him a copy. So I emailed him, telling him that I now held JPEG images of the novel in my PC, but apologised for not being able to print out a physical copy for him. To my delight, I received a swift reply. I am also glad to help you to solve the problem. I am quite familiar with converting JPEG images to Word. If possible, please send these images to me, and I'll try using software to transform them. And he did just that, and I finally had a Word version I could offer to publishers. Now, the obvious choice should have been Loom Books, who currently have the last 6 of Glasby's Johnny Merrick novels in print, both individually and in the splendid 6-novel omnibus edition we see here, the Johnny Merrick Mysteries, books 1 to 6. But unfortunately, Loom Books now publish only e-books. I knew that, like me, all my friends and impossible crime collectors would much prefer a paper edition. So I sent it to John Betancourt at Wildside Press, who thankfully continues to publish both paper and e-book editions. The result is this new Wildside edition we see here. Now restored to print after nearly 70 years in limbo, this edition is an example of what can be achieved by the friendship of genuine enthusiasts in international goodwill involving Britain, China and America. It will be welcomed by collectors of locked room mysteries worldwide. It can be ordered direct from Wildside's website or from Amazon and other platforms. UK Amazon orders need to be searched for as This Time Forever by John Glasby. I'm only sorry that I couldn't have republished the book whilst John was alive.